Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm speaking with Mary Stanford on the thorny topic of authority and submission in Christian marriage. Hey everybody, today's episode is about a scriptural teaching that makes a lot of Catholics very uncomfortable, including many Catholics who would consider themselves very orthodox or devout, who perhaps accept a lot of the Church's most controversial teachings in general, still have trouble with this one. I'm referring to St. Paul's teaching in Ephesians 5 about marriage. In case you were wondering, the controversial part is not where he says that husbands should be prepared to die for their wives. No, that's not the controversial part. The controversial part is where, right before that, St. Paul says that wives ought to submit to their husbands as to Christ, because the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. So the topic of this episode is that controversial husbandly headship and wifely submission in Christian marriage. And my guest today, Mary Stanford, wrote one of the best things I've seen on this in an article for Homiletic and Pastoral Review, I think back in 2013. She looks at this teaching in the light of things like St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body and the thought of St. Edith Stein. And she does so in a way that's very nuanced, but without trying to sort of explain the teaching away. So I'm very pleased to present this interview with Mary Stanford to you. Mary has a master's degree in theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family in Washington, D.C. She is a mother of 7 and an adjunct instructor for the theology department at Christendom College in Virginia, and she has spoken around the country on the theology of the body. Mary Stanford, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Our topic today is authority and submission in marriage, both in terms of the natural law and what has been purified and supernaturalized in Christ and the teachings of the Church. So I think before we start, actually, maybe you could give us a little bit of your background in talking about marriage.
Well, thank you so much. My background is interesting. I have an experiential dimension. I've been married for 19 years, mother of 7 children. But my interest in marriage and family goes back to college. And after majoring in philosophy with a deep interest in understanding theological anthropology, I studied at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. And there really started to go more deeply into thinking about it. And over the years, again and again, in speaking about different aspects of marriage and family, one of the things that kept kind of coming back to me again and again was every time I would be at Mass and hear a homily on Ephesians 5, 21, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, I would notice that the priest would usually spend most of the time explaining what it didn't mean, or perhaps even skipping parts of it. And I could feel that he was at pains to kind of get through the awkwardness of that reading. And I decided to sort of try to tackle it in my own thoughts and look to see what the Church has taught and how to really explain not just what it isn't, but what it is, what it does mean. And that was a long time ago. Ultimately, after giving many talks, I put together my thoughts into an article in Homiletic and Pastoral Review. And it's just something that I keep coming back to in my teaching. I teach a course in the Theology of the Body at Christendom College, and we spend a good chunk of time talking about this there.
Okay, great. So I think it would be good, because this is such a controversial topic. You know, it's funny that on many other topics of church teaching, we wouldn't need to do this, but just to establish a kind of some presuppositions for the discussion, because the discussion is on, again, authority and submission in Christian marriage. And of course, the controversial part of that is the idea of wives obeying their husbands. And depending on who you are, you may or may not have a discomfort with the idea of the husband being the head of the family, but in terms of getting into obedience and, quote unquote, laying down the law and things like that people talk about, that's where it gets awkward. So first I'll say is it's a shame that, any priest would be embarrassed by the teaching of St. Paul. And maybe perhaps he isn't, but perhaps he is nervous about what the response is going to be. So that causes him to almost treat it as something embarrassing, even if in his heart of hearts he agrees with it. So in this conversation, we are not going to be embarrassed by St. Paul or his teachings or the teaching of the church. I think another important principle here, and I'd hope that my listeners generally probably don't need to hear this, but I would say that this is a teaching that has been emphasized much more before Vatican II than after it. But so I just want to establish that if something is taught authoritatively by a pope in an encyclical or otherwise, that teaching doesn't have an expiration date. So it doesn't go away just because it hasn't been strongly reiterated within a certain span of time. And there's nothing about Vatican II that makes it this magic cutoff line. Of course, again, I'm sure that most of my listeners know this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time making that argument, but I'm just going to say that's a presupposition for our discussion. Yes. As faithful Catholics, we are trying to recover the entirety of the Church's teaching from all eras. And a corollary of that is any reflections by modern popes need to be interpreted in light of prior teachings in such a way that they don't either reverse them or completely redefine the words in order to preserve the mere appearance of continuity. So we are looking for, it's quite the opposite. The words may change, but it's the spirit that needs to be continuous. So I think, I'm sure, I'm not even going to ask if you're on board with that because I know you are. Yes. Okay, so for the listeners, Mary and I didn't want to spend this episode establishing and arguing that the authority of the husband over the wife is the teaching of the church. We want to take it for granted that is the teaching of the church and go deeper into it and explain what it means and what it doesn't mean. So to enable us to do that, I'm just going to take a few minutes now to lay some groundwork and give the sources for this teaching. So in case anybody is still doubting that this is church teaching based on Ephesians 5 alone, I'll just make that clear with some of the modern encyclicals that have referenced and reiterated this teaching. And then after that, Mary is just going to totally go to town on it. So please just bear with me for a little bit here. The injunction for wives to submit or to obey their husbands is repeated 6 times in the New Testament. It's in 1 Corinthians. It's in 1 Corinthians 11, I should say. Ephesians 5, which you mentioned, that's the most famous scriptural passage on marriage and the most comprehensive way that we understand marriage in light of the cross. Colossians 3, Timothy chapters 2 and 3, Titus chapter 2, and 1 Peter chapter 3, which I think along with Timothy and Ephesians is the longest treatment of this. This has been the teaching of the church for the entirety of Christian history, and it has been reiterated most clearly and recently in multiple papal encyclicals, but in particular, the encyclical on Christian marriage, Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae by Pope Leo XIII, and Casti Connubii by Pope Pius XI. So I'm just saying this to establish the church teaching, and then we'll get into your thoughts on why this all is and how we can understand it and how more recent papal teachings and reflections can be interpreted in light of the sort of baseline teaching on authority and submission in marriage. And just as an example, because I don't think we need to read all of Ephesians 5, I think we'll be referencing it frequently enough that people will remember the passage. I'm going to read a couple of passages from Pope Pius XI's Casti Connubii. And I'll just note that in all of the clear papal teachings on this matter, they make clear that the husband's headship over the family and the wife's obligation to deference and obedience is taught explicitly as being part of human nature, taught as being God's plan for the family, confirmed and supernaturalized in Christ, rather than as a consequence of or a concession to the fall, because a lot of people will say it's just a consequence of the fall. as or a concession to our fallen nature, because they're kind of conflating domination and headship, or enslavement and submission in the Christian sense. So, and the other thing I'll say about it, just as a preface to this passage from Cassie Kanubi, is that the popes, especially Leo the 13th and Pius the 11th, are teaching this explicitly as something that has been handed down. So they're saying it in a very clear and authoritative way in their capacity as the one who has the office of preserving what has been handed down. Okay, so enough of that. I'm just going to now read a little bit from Cassie Kanubi. Pope Pius XI says, "Domestic society being confirmed, therefore, by this bond of love, there should flourish in it that order of love, as St. Augustine calls it. This order includes both the primacy of the husband with regard to the wife and children, and the ready submission of the wife and her willing obedience, which the apostle commands in these words." And here he's quoting Ephesians 5:23. "Let women be submissive to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." He continues, "This submission, however, does not deny or take away the liberty which fully belongs to the woman, both in view of her dignity as a human person and in view of her most noble office as wife and mother and companion, nor does it bid her obey her husband's every request, if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to the wife. Nor, in fine, does it imply that the wife should be put on a level with those persons who in law are called minors, to whom it is not customary to allow free exercise of their rights on account of their lack of mature judgment or their ignorance of human affairs. But it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body which is the family, the heart be separated from the head, to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. For if the man is the head, the woman is the heart, and as he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she may and ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. Again, this submission of wife to husband in its degree and manner may vary according to the different conditions of persons, place, and time. In fact, if the husband neglect this duty, it falls to the wife to take his place in directing the family. But the structure of the family and its fundamental law, established and confirmed by God, must always and everywhere be maintained intact. With great wisdom, our predecessor Leo XIII, of happy memory, in the encyclical on Christian marriage, which we have already mentioned, speaking of this order to be maintained between man and wife, teaches, the husband is the chief of the family and the head of the wife. And I'll just read one short other passage from this same encyclical. Cassie Kanubi, Pius says, he describes as false teachers those who, quote, do away with the honorable and trusting obedience which the woman owes to the man. Many of them even go further and assert that such a subjection of one party to the other is unworthy of human dignity, that the rights of husband and wife are equal. Wherefore, they boldly proclaim the emancipation of women has been or ought to be effected. Okay, so with apologies for that long introduction, I think now we've set up the groundwork for entering into this discussion. So perhaps we can start with where you start in your article for Homiletic and Pastoral Review, which I'll link to in the show notes for this episode, which is the idea of what male and female's bodies reveal about the way that they love and the way that they give themselves to each other. So we have this idea of mutual self-gift, but it is not a symmetrical relationship.
Right. And again, I drew a lot on the wisdom of Edith Stein in looking at this. And just, sort of you start from the physical, right? And from a physical perspective, a woman's body is receptive. It is designed to receive and nurture a human person. Whether or not a woman ever has a baby in her life, that is physically how she's set up. And since we believe a human person is more than just a body, the idea is that a woman's whole person is oriented toward another. Okay, so her intellectual abilities, her emotions, that she's geared not just bodily, but psychologically, spiritually, her entire person is oriented in a certain way, in a very specific way, toward the nurture of persons. Now, men, their bodies are characterized by not so much a receptivity to a person, but they are characterized by a size and strength. They are designed to act on the world, to work, okay? And so while their work is certainly for the sake of persons, their immediate outlook tends to be one which is more deed, action, object-oriented, whereas a woman's is more person-oriented. And so we see right from the beginning, just naturally, that the way in which men and women interact and the way in which they even see themselves is distinct. And one way we see this, man and woman, they come to their sense of sexual identity in a different way. We usually don't see women running around trying to prove that they're women. Edith Stein tells us that a woman's body kind of reveals to her that she is a woman from an early age. Her monthly cycles remind her that she's a woman, whereas a man, he might be a strong teenage boy who's, 6 feet tall and muscles, and he doesn't necessarily feel like a man. Okay, he wants to go and hit that home run, score that touchdown, win that debate. He wants to use that body and do something. And then when he does that accomplishment, and that accomplishment is admired and respected and applauded and appreciated, wow, suddenly he feels affirmed as a man. So there's a sense in which the way in which men and women see themselves and the way in which they experience personal affirmation, that too is different. And so these things are going to factor into the dynamics of a marriage.
So, with following upon that immediately is, whatever is good and natural in our nature is, that informs the faults that we have, the way that original sin corrupts that nature. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about the differing effects of original sin on men and women. I mean, perhaps starting with the Genesis account as our
definitely, with the Genesis account, after we see the first sin, and we see it sort of in two different ways. We see Adam told that thorns and thistles are going to resist his work. Okay, if man's work is sort of the way in which he expresses himself and even sees himself, that work is going to be difficult and toilsome, and it's going to be an issue. And we do see the way in which men sometimes, whether it's their desire for wealth, sometimes Edith Stein talks about a meaningless piling up of wealth. Sometimes men become workaholics, and they spend so much time working that they don't have time for personal relationships. They're focusing so much on the object and the thing and the goal that sometimes, they will, in a sense, see women right along with that. They'll see women as just another thing to be conquered, another object, another thing. We see the ways in which, in the way I mentioned earlier, how young men sort of want trophies and they want proof that they are, in fact, men. And it's very easy for men to see cars and women and status as a kind of trophy in life. And so we see that can really get out of hand. On the other hand, we see a woman is being told, okay, I will multiply the pangs of your childbirth. So, okay, we know that pain and suffering entered the world in that way, but in a particular way, she'd have this difficulty. But I think the kicker is the next line when he talks about their relationship with one another. And that is, your desire shall be for your husband, and he will lord it over you. And that is really the sort of, as I put it, it's the kicker, because you can focus on one side. You can say, okay, the man's going to lord it over her, dominate her, objectify her, abuse her, see her as a just source of pleasure alone, a toy. And certainly through the centuries, that has happened. But we don't always look at the other side. Your desire shall be for your husband. Nonetheless, you're going to keep desiring him. You're going to want that relationship. A woman is so person-oriented that she is going to crave relationship with a man so badly that at times she's going to be willing to do so at the expense of her own dignity. This idea of her wanting it so badly that, not that she's always inviting abuse, that's not the case, but that through seduction, through a willingness to settle, that she will find herself in a situation where she's not being treated according to her dignity. And one way that I like to put it is that men are born to give and to do. They want to, by their very nature, do something, make something, accomplish something that will hopefully be received and appreciated. They want to win someone's love, right? Men bring the flowers, the chocolates, the candy, whatever. They are the ones that are presenting something in hopes that it will be received favorably by a woman. What happens with sin is that men become so intent on pleasure. Okay, we see this new disorder in the human person, and it becomes very difficult for men to give. And women who are naturally ordered toward receptivity actually struggle to receive. They don't want to wait to receive. They want to get what they want so badly without receptivity, without vulnerability. Okay, and you see that happen in a lot of ways. You can see it through ways in which women don't want to wait for what they want. They want to go for it. But what it really means is they don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to be receptive. So we have this sin introduces this resistance where a man would be the sort of most overt giver and the woman the most overt receiver. We see suddenly men just want to take, they don't want to give, and women don't want to receive. We just want to go for what we want. So we're sort of in a mess, human condition, and this is the state of humanity, certainly before the grace of Christ is introduced into the world.
So I think, one of the reasons it's so sad for people to be embarrassed by Ephesians 5 is it really is our most complete guide to what marriage looks like, which is redeemed. So it's unfortunate, it begins with that line, which is difficult for people, but perhaps if it begins there, then, that line is important, that line about wives being subject to their husbands as to the Lord. So how is this relationship, this deeply dysfunctional and at times abusive relationship between men and women redeemed in the light of Christ's sacrifice?
Right. And again, it is in light of Christ's sacrifice. And it's really made possible because of the grace that he gives us to overcome the sinful tendencies that tend to plague each side. And when you think about, again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what submission really looks like in a marriage. But nonetheless, when you hear the words, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He gave his life. He gave life to the church by literally giving his life. So men, husbands are called to give and give and give to the point of death, for their loved ones. That, right from the beginning, we should sense, okay, this is something new. Okay, this is not canceling the asymmetry, but it is definitely not simply reinforcing this dominating male, servile female picture of fallen humanity. And again, John Paul will draw our attention to the line right before that, which is be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands as to the Lord. Then he goes into it, but that this new redeemed relationship is only made possible because in and through each person's, the husbands and the wives' pre-existing relationship to Christ, that's where they're finding their motivation to live out this new redeemed kind of headship and submission within marriage.
So perhaps we could look at the word authority. What does authority mean? What's its function? What's its meaning in a Christian context?
Right. And again, you look at the word authority, you see the word author there. It's connected to the idea of a source. Okay, an author brings a thing to life. It gives it life. And again, God is really the only true author in the ultimate sense of the word. But again, when you think about how did Christ give life to the church, he did it by actually giving his own life. And so that authority is ultimately rooted in gift. And this is a difficult concept because when we hear the word authority today, the modern mind thinks power, might, manipulation, control. Again, this misunderstanding of authority goes right back to the Garden of Eden. That is the suggestion that the devil makes to Eve. Okay, that God's relationship to them is not one of God as gracious giver and they as these grateful receivers of their very lives, their being, and everything around them. No, he says, nope. God knows if you eat that apple, you will have the knowledge to be like gods. He's just holding back. God is just trying to control and manipulate and keep power from you. Okay, so right from the beginning, the devil suggested that no. Knowledge is power. As soon as you eat that apple, you'll have the knowledge to be like God. Knowledge is power. When that is a suggestion that Adam and Eve, they buy into, but nonetheless, there's no support for it. Okay, God had given them nothing but beauty and blessings and love and goodness in the garden. So they had no reason to believe that this gift was anything other than a gift. Okay, God expresses himself. He expresses his power by giving. And so right from the beginning, humanity misunderstands gifts. We don't understand gifts very well today in our culture. We really don't understand what it means to actually be thankful for something. And, we're a culture of gift cards and what do I want for my birthday and feeling obligated when someone gives us something and wanting to discharge the debt and, give something back so you don't owe them. We don't understand gift. But if you go back to the very beginning, we see there was a misunderstanding that was proposed by the devil that authority is something bad, something manipulative and controlling, when really the true meaning of authority is gift-giving, life-fostering love. And that's what the husband is called to do.
If the meaning of authority is tied up with giving gifts, then that tells us something about in what sense the wife must submit to her husband. And you make this very profound point in your article, which really struck me, which is that you do not receive a gift on your terms.
Yeah. When you look at the sort of structure of a gift, I talk about this with my students a lot. I draw a little diagram. There's a giver. Every successful gift has a giver and a receiver. And the giver, in offering that gift, is truly vulnerable. They're vulnerable because their gift could be rejected or abused, mistreated. And yet, on the other end of the gift, the receiver is vulnerable and has to trust that this gift is truly just that. It's not an attempt to control, to manipulate, to trap me, right? It is, in fact, an expression of the other's love. And in receiving it, it's it's a privilege, but it's daunting because the way in which a gift is received has a direct effect on the giver. Okay, you have the capacity in receiving a gift to receive it as it is given, as it is offered, no demands, no expectations, and to receive it with the word we call gratitude, right? That's rooted in the word gratis, which means free. You are freely receiving. You're choosing to accept it as a whole. If you put demands on it, it's not really a gift. It's an order, right? It's something you've ordered or something that if it's something that's owed to you, that's justice or business or commerce or something. It's not the same thing as a gift. And so the receiver of a gift really plays a tremendous role in how the giver is going to feel based upon this response. And if you abuse the gift, the giver is wounded. If you only take what you want from the gift and sort of toss the rest, I always use the example with my kids of if my husband proposed to me and I took his engagement ring and I said, wow, this is a beautiful ring, but that diamond is really tiny and shabby. Let's perhaps take it back to the jeweler and maybe we can get a bigger one. And so I say, well, I accepted part of the gift. No, he's not going to feel good when I do that. So that a gift is not ordered. It's not really requested. And when it's received, it has to be received as a whole and in the way that it's offered. If any of those things is missing, the gift is not a gift, or the gift is spoiled and the giver is wounded. So there's a tremendous responsibility that falls on the receiver. They have a tremendous power in that way.
Obviously, both the husband and the wife are giving themselves to each other, but maybe we could say that as St. Francis says, it's in giving that we receive. There's a sense in which for the wife, it's in receiving that she gives.
Absolutely. And I talk about this too, that when I think in the course of my own marriage, I've certainly performed many good deeds for my husband. A lot of cooking, a lot of cleaning, a lot of children raising, a lot of getting up in the middle of the night, and he treasures and values all of those things. But I can tell you with certainty that the greatest gift that I've given to my husband is responding in a loving, grateful, appreciative manner to everything that he does for me. That's what builds him up. That's what keeps him happy. And it keeps him happy and continually trying to make me happy. So it's amazing the way I know I do a lot. He knows I do a lot, but I know that I could be doing all of those things, getting up with the kids, working a part-time job, whatever it is. There's a lot of things that wives do, but if they're not receiving their husband's gifts well, he's not going to feel appreciated, respected. There's going to be unhappiness in that marriage, and none of that other stuff is going to matter to him. So definitely experience that.
So we've gotten to one aspect of the word submission, but I suspect that this may not be the part that people have the most trouble with, at least in theory, and they may have plenty of trouble with it in practice. I know, and doubtless they do, but we have to talk about this issue of obedience. And you mentioned this problem that we have with authority in modern times, and I'm thinking about how, in preparing for this discussion, I was reading some different things people had written on this topic, and I came across one writer online who clearly was of the school of thought that, John Paul II got rid of male authority over the wife and replaced it with mutual submission, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. And she kept repeating over and over again that in a loving relationship of companionship between peers, there is just no place for exercising authority or for obeying. That to her, that just completely would destroy the love, create resentment, et cetera, et cetera. She couldn't see the two as compatible whatsoever. And this is a really problematic idea because it stems from a broader attitude that we have towards authority. And if we're going to have that attitude towards our husband, then, or any authority over us, we're going to have that towards Christ, because it is a paradoxical thing, but Christ is both our Lord and our friend, and we are both his servants or even his slaves and his friends. And it's, I can't say that I understand that I understand the first thing about how that works and how can I possibly live with Christ as both my God and my friend. It's a total mystery to me. And, I trust that, I'll be illuminated in time, but, it's like the first principle of, relationship with Christ. So if it's not possible in a marriage, then it's not possible with Christ. But I guess the thing is that it's only possible in a marriage because Christ has made it possible in relation with himself.
Yes. And I think that's where that line about mutual subjection in Christ is so important, because it is qualifying. And even in, I've got lots to say about what John Paul says in the Theology of the Body, but even in Mulieris Dignitatem, he says that all of the reasons in favor of the subjection of the wife to the husband must be understood in the sense of a mutual subjection of both out of reverence for Christ. If they are not informed by the grace of Christ and they're not motivated by that relationship with Christ to live out this dynamic, it's not going to function properly. So from the beginning, yes. But as I point out in my article, and as I can say now after having been married for 19 years, that what I call final say decisions, the thing that makes everybody so scared about this topic, like, is he making all the decisions and I'm obeying him? The fact is, no man wants to make all the decisions. Believe me, they don't. Okay. So these final say decisions where you just can't reach a consensus, they're rare. Okay. They're rare, but they're big ones, right? They come up every couple years. and what I've come to learn is a couple things. Number one, that he doesn't really want the responsibility any more than I do. But, but as Edith Stein says, the husband is not Christ, okay? But he's called to be the image of Christ in this relationship. So number one, he knows he's not perfect. And he knows he might make the wrong decision, okay? And yet, in these matters, okay, she says a woman has a unique capacity. She says that women, because of our personal orientation and because of our desire for relationships, that very often we are willing to sort of get enthusiastic about things that are far from anything that would have interested us otherwise for the sake of the relationship. I like to use the example of my football knowledge. I was not very interested in football, but when I was dating my husband, I noticed he was, and I got to hang around with him more if I would come over on a Sunday afternoon and watch some football with him. And in that process, I'm not going to lie, I came to appreciate it more, and I really do. I like it a lot more than I did. But I'm not sure if he would have been able to do the same thing with me over, say, romantic comedies or, I don't know, some of my other interests, because men are very much object-oriented. They're focused on the thing itself. It's harder for them to get on board with the decision that they truly don't see the logic for, the reason for. Women do have a capacity to get on board with something that they may not totally agree with. I'm not talking about something that's morally wrong, but something, an option for the family that they don't totally agree with for the sake of the relationship. It does tend in general to be a gift that we have to get on board with something. What's more important is that in making that final say decision, he is going to be more willing to take responsibility for it, particularly if it fails. Because let's face it, things fail. Guys are not perfect. Husbands are not perfect. They're not omniscient, right? They can't predict the future. Things go sideways sometimes. But if they go sideways and it was his call, he's going to be on board to make it right. And I think deep down, what it really shows, obedience, we also misunderstand obedience in our culture, but obedience is not really, we like to talk about it being a blind thing. Obedience isn't blind. Why does my child obey me? Sometimes I'll give explanations to my kids for why I want them to do something, but other times they're not ready to understand it or I'm in a hurry. And I'll look at them and I'll say, do you think that I love you? And they'll say, yes. Well, do you think that I would make a decision that isn't good for you? And they always say, no, Mom. Do you trust me? And they'll say yes. So ultimately, going with the will of another is an expression of your trust. And for me to say, husband, all right, I trust you in this. It is absolutely a part of that gift dynamic, because when I laid out that gift dynamic before about the giving and the receiving, both sides are having to trust, okay? But when someone trusts in you, okay, particularly as a man, when someone says, I trust you, I believe in you, that is going to build them up and ideally give them the strength to go forward and claim responsibility. So again, these situations don't usually happen very often in a marriage, and this seems to be the aspect of obedience that we get so riled up about. But an act of obedience is ultimately an act of trust, which is absolutely an expression of love for the other. And building that unity that a family so desperately needs, and that building up the man so that he can claim responsibility, especially when things go sideways, is essential in building that family unity.
There's a talk that I skimmed earlier today that Pope Pius XII gave to newlyweds, and that is one of the things, and it's a very thorough discussion of all of these topics. He doesn't focus it on wifely obedience to the husband, but when speaking of that, what he really tries to drive home is that this is not just something that wives should accept. It is something that they should love and be grateful for. And I think that we have to look at some of the ways that the husband's authority helps the woman to fulfill her vocation and helps her to be an image of the church. It has to be the case, right, following St. Paul, Ephesians 5, that the wife's submission to her husband helps him to image Christ, and that the husband's authority helps her to image the church. So what are some ways in which that would be the case?
The way in which a wife grows in her ability to image the church. Well, again, I think she is a witness to the trust that we need to have in Christ. And the beauty there is, again, your husband isn't perfect, okay, but Christ is. And so trusting in him, and knowing that he then claims responsibility for you, is incredibly freeing. And again, I think that the unity that is achieved in a family, if you're able to pull it off, if you're doing it right, it's so powerful. And the peace that comes over the family, even in hard times, that can happen when that dynamic is there, is truly a glimpse, I think, of heaven and that total unity between bride and bridegroom.
I think it's worth talking about the ways in which husbands have to submit themselves, in a sense. First of all, when you claim your proper authority that has been given to you, you are submitting yourself to that authority, and you're submitting yourself to the giver of that authority. So I think it's worth saying first and foremost that, when a husband claims his proper authority and responsibility, aside from the fact that authority comes with a great responsibility, and it's certainly not easy, he is being obedient to the higher authority from which his own authority proceeds. And I think claiming your authority is not a matter of sort of desiring it for your own aggrandizement. And certainly that was not the case with Saint Joseph. He was not claiming his proper authority over the Holy Family out of any sense of superiority or taking any glory for himself. I'm sure that it's something that he accepted with fear and trembling. And yet God very clearly made him the head of the Holy Family, and both of the other members of which were clearly superior to him.
Yes.
And yet the angel appeared to him to tell him that they needed to flee to Egypt and not to marry. He was the one that God spoke to as head of the family to make that decision, just as one example. So that's one way in which the husband is submitting, but perhaps we can talk a little bit more about this idea from John Paul II of mutual submission, which is properly understood not as a replacement for, the idea of authority and obedience, but as the broader light of Christian social relations, in which this marriage relationship is also to be understood. The light of, as one of many social relationships, and also as one of many ways in which we relate to Christ in others. And, I'll just say something came up tonight, which was interesting and very apropos, which is today is the Feast of St. Dominic, as I mentioned to you before we started the interview. And I was at Mass. My parish is a Dominican parish, and the pastor in his homily was speaking about the way that your superior in the Dominican order is still your brother or your sister, and they have to be both at once. So it's this paradoxical thing, as with Christ, which I brought up before. And the way Father Walter, my pastor, was putting it is that, when he was in charge of novices at one point, he was himself having to be obedient to the gift of those placed in his care, to their circumstances, to their needs, in ruling over them. And he brought up the parallel of Christ and Mary at the wedding of Cana. He said that Christ obeyed Mary at Cana because he recognized God's will operating through the comment that she made to him. So in any circumstances, when we're doing our duty, we are obeying in a very literal sense, the needs of the circumstances. So that's one sense in which that is. But what are some specific concrete ways in which mutual submission would play out in a marriage? We've already talked quite a bit about how wives would submit to their husbands. In what sense would a husband submit to his wife in a way that doesn't just flatten out this marriage relationship and make it symmetrical as though the two sexes were the same?
Again, I think I go back to the fact that I think by nature, a man wants to give, he wants to please. He really feels most affirmed when his deeds are received and appreciated. And so the truth is, most husbands, they want to please their wives. They're most happy when they feel that they have made their wives and children happy. A father likes to give good gifts to his children, right? It's, when he asks for an egg, he doesn't give him a scorpion, right? So that a man really thrives when he feels that he's making them happy. So again and again, half the time, more than half the time, 99% of the time, really, my own husband is looking to me, what should we do? He seeks my advice. He seeks my counsel. He knows my areas of expertise. He also knows areas that I don't know anything about. So there's this sense in which, as you put it, his authority is a heavy responsibility for him because, again, it doesn't just mean he gets whatever he wants. It's always about serving the family and our needs. And he looks to me in particular because I am a woman and I do have a pretty keen sense of my children's emotional and spiritual and intellectual needs. I'm always filling him in on who needs what, and then he takes it in and he comes back to me, okay, well, why do we do this? And so there's always this back and forth. And again, his authority is definitely, it's completely all about us. It's not about him. And someone that would abuse that authority would think it's all about me and wife serve me. And that's the sort of idea that we get in our heads. And it's just not the case. Even in the quotation that you read from Costa Kanubi, he says, a wife, nor does this bid her to obey her husband's every request, if not in harmony with the right reason or with the dignity due to a wife, right? These things have to be reasonable. And really what it means is, every day he's trying to please me and make me happy. But again, then that it forces us to think, okay, well, what is the best course of action? And yes, we want a lot of things. What are the things important to our family? And so then again, I just want to read back to Costa Kanubi when he says this command of wives being subordinate to their husbands, he says, it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. Okay? And in other words, Mom, you're needed in the family. It's the same thing with the dad. Your authority is for the family. All of this dynamic is so that the family will be unified and fruitful. And this idea that somehow it's oppressive to the woman. No, this is what's going to make a family work. The dad bending over backwards to lay down his life, and the woman receiving it gratefully, trusting him and establishing that unity. It has to be all about the family. It's never going to be all about him or all about her. When that happens, then we get into trouble.
Okay, so here's a common objection you'll hear, or an exception that people will try to make. What about when the husband isn't acting in a Christ-like way? What if he's lording it over his wife? Doesn't a wife only have to submit to her husband when he is, acting in a Christ-like way?
Well, good point. A couple things there. Certainly, as I mentioned, even in Costa Kanubi, it's got to be right reason, and it's certainly not sin. Okay, she's never bound to obey him in sin or in something that is just unreasonable. No. And certainly, for the sake of all of the listeners, in an abusive situation, nope. You need, for the sake of the family, for the sake of your children, to get help and not to think that this is behavior that should be accepted. But I'd say in most cases, it's okay. So he's failing to be a good giver. He's not giving what you need. He's not giving what you want. He's not getting it. That's the tough situation where you'd say, well, you just need to take over and you need to call the shots. You got to be careful with that simply because, we might call it, and I don't like this word, but, the nagging spouse. She's just going to say, this is how you do it and everything you do is wrong. And I'm just going to jump in. And okay, maybe there's moments of that, but too much of that, when you demand things, it negates, it sort of erases the gift dynamic, right? Because by nature, a gift is something offered and not demanded. And if a man thrives on giving and you're not allowing him to give, or you're letting him know that he has nothing worthwhile to give, you're going to kill his spirit. Okay, that's why, again, as I mentioned in the article, I talked to a marriage counselor who had counseled hundreds and hundreds of couples. And he said not a single man in therapy felt respected by his wife. Now, that doesn't mean that the husband didn't make tons of mistakes or that it was the wife's fault. But the point is, when a husband doesn't experience respect and esteem from the wife, the marriage is in big trouble. And so if there's things that you can be excited about and grateful for, I think you have to start there. You have to start there. Doesn't mean you don't seek counseling. Doesn't mean you can't try to communicate well on, what you need and what this family needs. But I think that the sort of, oh, you just need to take the reins and he can just take a back seat, it's a documented failure. And it wreaks its havoc on the family, because the presence of a strong father is what builds young men, teaches them how to be men, and it teaches the women what to look for in a man and how to be treated by a man. And it's very difficult when that's not there. So again, cases of abuse aside, I still think the best course of action is to appreciate what you can, because there's usually something there to appreciate, and it's just really easy to see the glass is half empty, especially, women are smart. Okay. A lot of times we know how to do things well, and we think, oh, if only he could just do it my way. And again, okay, but acting in a way that robs him of his ability to give and robs him of that feeling that you esteem and respect and trust him, it's very toxic to a marriage.
Speaking about even a situation where, let's say, the husband's genuinely a jerk, and he's not acting like a Christian at all. And I'm not talking about a situation of genuine abuse where you would really have to separate. But I think those are much fewer than situations where it's the guy's just a jerk. St. Peter answers this question directly in 1 Peter chapter 3, the first few verses. He says, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." And there's actually multiple examples of female saints who did exactly this. They had husbands who were jerks, who were cheating on them and things like that, and they were still loving and obedient and did their job as wives and mothers and prayed and strove for greater holiness themselves and saved their husbands' souls and the souls of their children in that way. St. Rita of Cascia is the one that comes to mind. But you also in your article have this great quote from St. John Chrysostom, which shows that it goes both ways as well. He says, quoting St. Paul, "Be subject to each other out of reverence for Christ." St. John says, "If your spouse does not obey God's law, you are not excused. A wife should respect her husband even when he shows her no love, and a husband should love his wife even when she shows him no respect." So we have to be careful here, because we also don't want to say that, if wives don't respect their husbands, they're excused from the obligation to love their wives.
Exactly. It's so true that anytime you're talking about a reality that involves more than one person, right? Community. You've got the husband, you have the wife. When they're both doing it right, it's heaven on earth, right? But the fact is, you could be doing everything right. And few of us do everything right, but you on paper could be doing everything right. But if the other isn't cooperating and isn't putting forth their best, there's going to be pain and suffering in a marriage and in a family. But because of the grace of God, yes, he can bring graces and rewards out of those sacrifices and sufferings. It's just sometimes it's a long time in coming. Like you talked about St. Rita, Elizabeth Lesueur. Are you familiar with her? I believe there's a cause for her canonization or for her beatification sort of underway. But she was French and her husband was an atheist that just mocked her faith. You wonder sometimes how couples end up together.
Oh, yes. I've read a bit about her.
I'm forgetting the name of her diary, but the point is many people came to her for counsel, and she was sickly and died a long death of cancer, was never able to have children. But after her death, her husband read her diaries and was deeply converted and ended up becoming a priest. So it's one of those where I don't want my story to be that story, but you see it. You see that faithfulness to your vocation to the end does pay off, even if you're not able to achieve that beautiful image of giving and receiving in this life. Because again, you could be doing your best and you can't control how the other person is going to be. So there's hope there in suffering marriages. There's still this witness, because again, you think of Christ in the church. Hey, we're not perfect, but Christ is always perfect. In a marriage, okay, the husband isn't Christ. So there's times when he's going to be the one who's failing. There's times when the wife, usually it's both, but that there still is even that hope for the suffering marriages.
And this is where it really comes back to the cross. I mean, we've talked about the mutuality. We've talked about the asymmetry between husband and wife, but we've also talked about the mutuality in submission, in which the husband has to, in a certain sense, submit himself to his wife. And this is a way in which, well, I mean, certainly husbands have to do this as well, but this is the example you gave is one in which Elizabeth Lesueur, had to give up her life for her husband. So ultimately, we're all imitating Christ. It's just that under the normal circumstances, that does manifest itself in in varying ways.
Yes. And again, it's a path, as John Paul likes to talk about in Theology of the Body, that marriage is a kind of training ground for self-gift. It's a place of learning to give and to receive in preparation for that final total giving and receiving that we're going to experience in the beatific vision. And again, sometimes it's just a matter of developing those virtues and becoming a good giver and a good receiver. And sometimes it's just suffering through the worst of travails. But it is all a preparation for this ultimate gift dynamic that we're going to experience in heaven.
Is there anything else that we should touch on here? Or is there anything else that we've sort of skipped over or that you'd like to talk about?
There's a couple things. I guess one of the things, and I guess it was sort of in response to this idea that, did John Paul maybe try to cancel the submission? And I really feel strongly that he didn't. If anything, he's the one that gave me the insight to really talk about the giving and receiving when he said, that there's a sense in which if the husband is called to be Christ, to give as Christ did, then that means that, here's the line, that the husband is above all the one who loves, and the wife, by contrast, is the one who is loved. One might even venture the idea that the wife's submission to the husband, understood in the context of the whole of Ephesians 5, means above all the experiencing of love. And for me, it was that nugget that helped me to really reflect on what does it mean to experience love and to reflect on that receptive attitude. And again, thinking about, and again, we talked about it already, but just this idea that yes, the final say decisions can be a big deal, but I really, truly believe that the day-to-day living of submission comes through that positive receiving, appreciation, respect that you show your husband that builds him up daily, even in the ups and downs of every day. And that really is hard, but that really does, I think, over time give him the joy and the courage to embrace his role better and to be able to keep making the sacrifices. So,
well, it's interesting too, because go ahead. Sorry.
No, you.
Well, speaking of continuity there, that what he says, St. John Paul II says there about, the woman, the way in which she submits is to receive the husband's love. There's a straight line, from Casti Connubii, because that's just what Pope Pius XI says. He says that if a man occupies the first place in headship, then women can be said to occupy the first place in love.
Yeah. And John Paul immediately, a few lines after that says, love excludes every kind of submission by which the wife would become a slave of the husband. And again, that's Casti Connubii says the same thing. It's not about slavery. It's about being, this loving, trusting companion. And so I see so much continuity there. And when I think about the insights that I've discovered in the Theology of the Body, so much of, another way to describe John Paul's Theology of the Body is what love means and what gift means. And he goes so deeply, deeply into that loving another human person is not to ever treat them as an object. And he's always trying to distinguish between this initial fallen state, the fallen relationship of man and woman, of one as object and objectifier, that is a result of the fall. And that what man and woman's relationship are called to be is not that. But so much of his work in Theology of the Body is done to undergird the principles of Humanae Vitae. And to talk about the fact that contraception is treating a woman as an object, and it is treating her as a slave, and it absolutely recommends that the husband abdicate any self-sacrificing authority. And so the specific, again, theology of the body touches on just a myriad of issues, but he says, at the outset, I'm writing this to really undergird the teaching of Humanae Vitae by going deep, deep, deep into what love really means. And for me, husbands that ask their wives to contracept are abdicating their authority. They're saying, oh yeah, let's not have any more kids. So that's my say, where I'm saying we're not going to have any more kids, but I'm not going to make any kind of sacrifice, right? If I really discern we ought not have a kid, I'm not going to make the sacrifice. You take this pill, I get to take, you get to be my object. And so he's saying that's not love. So I think that the principles, again and again, really call for the fact that love requires sacrifice. And it requires a true giving and receiving of the other. So these principles are just woven throughout again and again. And for me, I think that was really profoundly opened up horizons for how to understand this, I think, in the fullest, most complete way that really integrates what the scripture is telling us, in comparing this relationship to Christ and the church.
I think one of the reasons that people have been able to see John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem as kind of replacing what came before is that it doesn't present the whole scope of this teaching because it's not about marriage. It's about the dignity of women. So it says some things about the sense in which submission should or shouldn't be understood, but it doesn't really show how it relates to the headship of the man because it's just about women. It's not about marriage as a whole. And he also describes it as a meditation. So it's sort of dwelling on a certain topic and not really worrying about systematizing very much.
Yes.
So, it's worth saying that, but it's also worth saying, people should go back and read, for that reason, people should go back and read something like Casti Connubii for a sort of complete explication of Catholic teaching on marriage. And if they want to go into deeper reflections on any given point, they can consult something like Mulieris Dignitatem or the Theology of the Body.
Definitely. And I think those, again, having reread Mulieris Dignitatem, it is wonderful. It is a beautiful, beautiful meditation. And one of my favorite parts ties back to this conversation because he defines what he calls the genius of the woman in this. And it's very much consistent with what Edith Stein says. He says that motherhood, or a woman's potential for motherhood, involves a special communion with the mystery of life. He says that the unique contact that a woman has with a new human being profoundly marks her personality, and that women are more capable than men of paying attention to another person. He says that this gift, this is the feminine genius, the capacity to pay attention, to be sensitive to the person. And, he's looking at women thinking, oh, the church thinks we're second best and we need to be just like men. He's saying, wait a minute. Okay, you can do a lot of things that men can do, but don't leave your femininity behind. Do not leave this gift behind. And I'm looking right now at what Pius XI said in Casti Connubii when he says that exaggerated liberty, which cares not for the good of the family, that's what a woman needs to be careful not to do. In other words, what he's saying is the family needs mom. The family needs that woman. If there is not that force that has that unique gift of paying attention to the needs and feelings, that extra sensitivity, her gift is her sensitivity. Believe me, sometimes it's our curse, but it is her gift. That needs to be in the home. Now, the world needs it too, but the family needs it. And so, one way of saying this is, listen, we need you in the family. We need you, your presence. You know how to be present to the children. You know how to be sensitive to their needs and feelings. And our culture today doesn't see that. We don't appreciate it. We think, oh, well, as long as you can get a job that pays a lot, and as long as you can pay for somebody to raise your kids, well, just do that. We don't value the presence of the mother, and yet the children do. And their development really hinges so much upon that foundational relationship. So again, there is so much to value in Mulieris Dignitatem, but no, it is not written to tell women how to submit or to even really affirm that teaching. It's talking about the deep deep dignity that Christ affirms in everything that he does, in every interaction with women, to say, no, 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 no. The Catholic Church believes that women are amazing. They just don't want them to ditch their gifts. But yeah, if you're going to look for the teaching, headship and marriage, it's clearly stated in Casti Connubii. But I do think it's important because even that says, that it can change in its manner according to times and places. So pretty soon you're thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. How do I submit then? It starts with gift. And so I think understanding the gift, the gift of focusing on the gift dynamic that St. John Paul gives us is really key in establishing good marriages.
So was there one other thing that you wanted to talk about, or was that it?
I'm trying to think. Yeah, so I wanted to get to that idea of the genius of women. I wanted to talk about contraception because it came back full circle to me how important that is. And that is something that is not valued today. On the one hand, you say, why does a wife have to submit? But I think an even bigger question today is, why does she even need, what does she bring? Why can't she just go out and be an earner? It's not that she's not necessarily earning for the sake of the family, but her gift, her specific gift is often overlooked. And that's something that John Paul again and again pointed out. So it's complementing. I believe that everything he wrote complemented but doesn't change the teaching of the church. And if all he was going to do in his writings was sort of restate this, I'm not sure it would have been as effective, because even between 1930, when Pius XI was writing, which obviously things were bad then, you get to the 80s and 90s, and wow, it's like you're speaking a different language altogether to the culture. It's so bad. And John Paul was always trying to speak in what he called a new language, to try to speak to the culture, in the state that it was in at the time, which of course is the obligation of every pope to talk to the times. And I think that he was focusing on different things, but ultimately absolutely was in continuity with the family having to imitate Christ in the church.
Okay, Mary, that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this a difficult topic in a remarkably non-abrasive and sort of enticing way. Like it makes you want to live this way, so I can't speak for women, I suppose, but it all sounds very attractive. The way you put it is my point.
Choose carefully. And when you're dating, appreciate the man that in the dating process will try to make you happy in that way, and appreciate the efforts. And I think I've been blessed to have chosen well, but really I think that God had everything to do with that. But so much is the choice at the beginning.
Okay, so that's my interview with the wonderful Mary Stanford. I so enjoyed talking to her, and I hope whoever listens to this benefits from it. And if you did benefit from it, please consider sharing it with people too, because I think we should be helping people to appreciate the glory of this Catholic teaching instead of running away from it. And those of you who are married, of course, can do so first and foremost by your own example. Oh, and again, I'll link to Mary's article as well as some of the other resources mentioned in this episode at the show notes page, catholicculture.org/episode 48. Now, I'm going to be away for a little bit, so I don't think that there will be an episode next week, but the 2 weeks after next week, episodes 49 and 50 of the podcast, I'm going to have a whammy of a 2-episode interview for you about the great English Catholic Renaissance composer. I'm very excited to get into editing that one. There's going to be a lot of music in there, so I think you're going to really enjoy it. So until then, God bless you, and please enjoy what remains of your summer, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.